All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a question that I think a lot of people have probably wondered about at some point, but maybe not really wanted to ask out loud.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, we're going to try to get to the bottom of whether there really is a smarter sex.
Wow. Jumping right into it, huh?
Well, we've got this really interesting review article from the Educational Psychology Review. It was published back in 2000, and it does a really nice job of kind of laying out the landscape of what we know scientifically about sex differences when it comes to intelligence.
Makes sense. So a good deep dive then.
Exactly. Should be a lot to unpack.
Well, for those listening who are interested in quickly and thoroughly understanding this complex topic, that's what we do here. And I think right off the bat, it might seem like, a pretty simple question. But the more you think about it, the more you realize how much is wrapped up in this question of a smarter sex.
That's for sure.
I mean, think about it. We're talking about deeply ingrained societal beliefs, not to mention the fact that this question has real-world implications for things like education and how we think about equity in general.
It's true. And I think even before we can even begin to think about whether one sex is smarter, we have to grapple with this huge question of how do we even define intelligence in the first place?
Right, exactly. Like, it's not this simple one-dimensional thing that we can just measure with a ruler, is it?
Not at all. We have all these different theories about what intelligence is. Some say it's a single general ability factor, the famous G factor. Others argue that there are multiple intelligences, like musical intelligence or interpersonal intelligence.
And then you've got those distinctions between, crystallized intelligence, which is basically all the stuff you've learned over time, versus fluid intelligence, which is more about your ability to solve new problems and think flexibly.
And then some folks even want to broaden the definition even more to include things like practical intelligence, emotional intelligence, even kinesthetic intelligence.
And that's all fascinating. But here's the thing. When it comes to the intelligence tests that we most commonly use in education, think about the WAIS, the WISC, the Stanford Binet, Raven's progressive matrices, even the SAT and GRE for college admissions. These tests are really primarily designed to predict academic success, and specifically within kind of a Western cultural context.
Right, meaning they're created and validated based on how well they correlate with things like, school grades and achievement tests.
Exactly.
So they tend to focus on the kinds of knowledge and skills that are usually taught and valued in Western educational systems.
Things like understanding word meanings or being able to do logical reasoning or having good working memory so you can hold information in mind and manipulate it.
Exactly, which kind of brings us to this whole issue of trying to answer this smarter sex question by simply comparing average IQ scores,
Right.
which on the surface might seem like the most obvious way to go about it.
Sure.
But what a lot of people don't realize is that these intelligence tests are actually intentionally designed, so there are no overall average sex differences in IQ scores.
How do they do that?
Well, the test makers very carefully select and balance the questions on the test to make sure that they don't consistently favor one sex over the other.
So they're basically trying to build a test that doesn't have what you might call a built-in gender bias.
That's the idea. But even though the overall IQ scores tend to come out pretty similar for males and females, as the review points out, when you start to look at the individual subtests that make up these broader IQ tests, that's where you start to see some intriguing differences.
So while the big picture might look balanced, when you zoom in, there are some average differences in certain cognitive abilities between the sexes.
Right. Like maybe one sex tends to score a bit higher on average on, say, a verbal fluency subtest, while the other sex might have a slight edge on a spatial reasoning task.
Makes sense. And tying that back to real-world outcomes, it's interesting that we also tend to see more males than females at both ends of the IQ spectrum.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, it means that males are overrepresented among folks who are diagnosed with intellectual disabilities and learning disorders.
Ice.
But they're also overrepresented at the very high end of the IQ scale. So more males with, say, exceptionally high IQs.
Interesting. It's kind of like if you think of intelligence as this bell curve, males seem to be a bit more spread out at both tails of the curve.
That's a good way to put it. Now, the review also does a nice job of addressing some arguments that have been made for the idea of, male intellectual superiority.
Which I'm sure we've all heard before in one form or another.
Yeah, it's out there. And one of the researchers they focus on is a guy named Lin, who's made some controversial claims about male IQ being higher, at least in certain populations he studied. He also points to the fact that On average, men's brains are a bit larger than women's brains.
So basically saying bigger brain equals more smarts.
Yeah, kind of making that leap.
But that doesn't really make sense when we think about, you know, elephants and whales, for example.
Hmm.
Their brains are way bigger than ours.
Right. Size isn't everything, and that's one of the things the review really emphasizes. It's not just about how big your brain is, it's about how it's structured, how the different parts are connected, and how it functions.
Makes sense.
And even though, on average, men's brains are slightly larger, even after accounting for differences in body size, that doesn't necessarily translate to higher intelligence.
I feel like we could have a whole separate episode just on brain size and intelligence, but it sounds like the review is basically saying it's just not that simple.
Definitely not. And they also point out that, when you're using tests that are intentionally designed not to show overall sex differences, to then argue that one sex is smarter, that's kind of a problem.
Yeah, if the tests are designed to level the playing field, so to speak, how can you then use them to say one group is inherently superior?
Right, it's kind of a contradiction. Plus, Lynn's findings haven't always been replicated by other researchers, and they don't always hold up when you look at the broader population samples that these tests are standardized on.
Got it. So the brain size argument might be intriguing, but it's not the whole story.
Not by a long shot.
Okay, so the review also talks about another researcher, Jensen, who actually looked at intelligence tests that weren't specifically designed to have equal average scores for males and females.
Oh, interesting. So taking a different approach.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that Jensen didn't find any evidence for overall sex differences in the average level of that general intelligence factor, G.
So no difference in that core intelligence factor, according to his research.
Right. But he did observe that males tended to do better on some specific cognitive tasks, while females tended to excel on others.
Okay, so some areas of relative strength for each sex, even if the overall G factor is similar.
Exactly. And this actually aligns with findings from another study by Stumpf and Stanley, who looked at achievement tests and advanced placement exams. They found differences on individual tests, but when they kind of zoomed out and looked at the overall picture across all the tests, these differences basically canceled each other out.
So some individual variations, but the big picture is pretty balanced.
Right. And the review really emphasizes how much this whole discussion about intelligence is so loaded with societal baggage.
Absolutely. It's not just some neutral, objective topic, is it?
Not at all. And our own personal beliefs and biases can really affect how we interpret the research findings.
That's so true.
Which is why some people argue that we shouldn't even be studying sex differences in intelligence in the first place.
Yeah, I've heard that argument, like it's just going to reinforce stereotypes and create more division.
Right. But the authors of this review actually make a pretty compelling case for why it's important to use scientific methods to try to understand these differences. Because whether we like it or not, these beliefs about sex differences and intelligence already exist in society, and they do have real-world impacts.
So ignoring the issue doesn't make it go away.
Not at all. And if anything, by studying it carefully and rigorously, we might be able to understand what's really going on and maybe even challenge some of those harmful stereotypes.
I see their point. It's like if we avoid talking about it, then the only information people have to go on are those potentially biased and inaccurate stereotypes.
Exactly. Of course, one of the big challenges is that it's really hard to create intelligence tests that are completely free of any kind of bias.
That makes sense. Like, how do you even define what's fair or unbiased when it comes to measuring something as complex as intelligence?
Right. The review uses the general information subtest of the WAIS as a good example of how seemingly neutral general knowledge questions can actually end up being biased just because of differences in the typical life experiences and interests of males and females.
I'm curious, what kind of examples did they give?
Well, they talk about things like, questions about refrigerator safety versus questions about geography or computer technology.
Okay, so questions that might tap into knowledge that's more common in one group than the other, just because of the kinds of things they're typically exposed to or interested in.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually point to research showing that even in college, male and female students tend to spend their time differently, which would naturally affect the kind of general knowledge they acquire.
That's an interesting point. Like, even if you control for, level of education, the types of knowledge people pick up can still vary based on their interests and experiences.
Right. So the big takeaway so far seems to be that when we look at overall intelligence, as measured by these standard IQ tests, the idea that one sex is just flat out smarter isn't really supported by the data.
Okay, so that initial question is kind of a bust.
But it gets much more nuanced and interesting when we start to drill down into specific cognitive abilities.
Right, because that's where we start to see some of these consistent average differences emerge.
Exactly. And the review really makes the case that exploring these specific cognitive skills is where the real insights lie.
And one of the most well-studied areas where we see these differences is in visual spatial abilities.
Now, when we talk about visual spatial abilities, we're not talking about just one single skill, right?
Now, it's actually kind of an umbrella term.
For several different types of skills that involve how we process visual information and think about things in space.
Exactly. So let's break it down a bit. We've got spatial perception, which is basically your ability to, like, judge what's vertical or horizontal, even when there are all sorts of distracting visual cues around.
Okay, so being able to kind of filter out the noise and focus on the essential spatial information.
Exactly. Then there's mental rotation, which is that classic ability to picture in your mind how a 3D object would look if you rotated it.
The one where they show you a shape and then ask you which of these other shapes is the same one just like turned around.
Right, exactly that. And then we've got spatial visualization, which is a bit more complex. It involves being able to do, like, multi-step mental manipulations of objects.
Okay, so more like imagining how you'd have to rearrange different shapes to fit them together into a certain pattern.
Yeah, that's a good example. Then there's spatiotemporal ability, which is about being able to understand and react to visual information that's changing over time.
So something like, being able to track a moving target or predict where something's going to go based on its trajectory.
Exactly. And finally, we have this ability to generate and maintain spatial images in your mind.
So like being able to picture a map in your head or vividly recall the layout of a room you've been in before.
That's it. So lots of different facets to these visual spatial abilities.
And the general finding here seems to be that males, on average, tend to have an advantage across most of these visual spatial tasks.
Yeah, that's the general pattern that emerges from the research.
But there was one exception.
Right. Spatial visualization, the one we talked about with, like, mentally rearranging shapes, that one seems to show a smaller and less consistent male advantage.
So maybe a bit more overlap between males and females on that particular skill.
Yeah, exactly. But overall, when you look at the big picture, the meta-analysis that the review cites, which combined the results of a huge number of studies, found a pretty significant average difference favoring males across all sorts of different visual spatial tasks.
And the fact that they had so many studies all pointing in the same direction really strengthens their conclusion.
Right? The sheer volume of evidence is hard to ignore. And they even calculated something called a fail-safe value, which basically tells you how many studies showing no difference would have to exist, but remain unpublished, to completely overturn the observed male advantage.
And what did that fail-safe value tell them?
It was incredibly high, like hundreds, maybe even thousands of studies.
Wow, that's a lot of hypothetical missing data.
Yeah, it really highlights the robustness of the finding.
Okay, so males generally have an advantage in visual spatial abilities.
That seems to be the case, at least on average.
And the review even points out that some of these findings from the lab actually seem to play out in real-world scenarios, right?
Yeah, they have some fun examples, like think about how people give directions.
Oh yeah, I've definitely noticed this.
Research has shown that men are more likely to use, like, those cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and they tend to be more accurate with those kinds of spatial directions.
And women, they're more likely to say, turn left at the big oak tree, then go 2 blocks, and it's the house with the red door.
Exactly. More landmark-based and left-right directions.
Which, in fairness, is usually how I give directions too.
And what's even more interesting is that these male advantages in visual spatial working memory, being able to hold and manipulate spatial information in your mind, they seem to show up pretty early in life.
How early?
Potentially as early as 3 years old, some studies suggest.
Wow, that's pretty young. So it might not be entirely due to, different life experiences or socialization.
Right. It suggests there might be some biological factors at play as well. And here's another interesting twist. Even as people get older, these differences in visual spatial abilities tend to persist.
Even though I think I've heard that older women tend to have less age-related decline in overall brain volume compared to men.
That's right. But despite that, older men often still perform better on those spatial tasks.
So it's not just about, how much brain tissue you have, it's about how it's functioning and how those different brain regions are connected and working together.
Absolutely. It's a complex interplay of factors.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about math. Because there's this common stereotype that, males are just naturally better at math. What does the review have to say about that?
Well, the review suggests that those male advantages that we sometimes see on tests of like higher level math reasoning might actually be tied, at least in part, to this tendency to use visual spatial strategies to solve problems.
Okay, so maybe they're kind of mentally picturing the problem in space and manipulating it that way.
Yeah, that's the idea. And there's a study they cite that found a connection between people's scores on those mental rotation tasks, the ones where you have to rotate objects in your mind,
Mhm.
and their scores on the math section of the SAT.
Interesting. So good at mental rotation, good at SAT math. Makes sense.
But here's the catch. That connection was especially strong in students who were specifically selected for having, like, above average math skills.
Okay, so in that really high achieving group.
Right. But when you look at the general population, the differences in math ability between males and females tend to be much smaller.
So it's more noticeable at that high end of math talent.
It seems that way. And the areas of SAT math where males tend to show the biggest advantage are in geometry and word problems, which often require that kind of mental representation and manipulation that we were talking about.
Right. It's like being able to picture the geometric shapes and how they fit together, or being able to create a mental model of the situation described in a word problem.
Exactly. And it's worth pointing out that in general, these sex differences in cognitive abilities, they tend to be most noticeable at both extremes of the ability distribution.
Meaning at the very high end and the very low end.
Right. So not just in math, but in other cognitive areas as well.
Which, of course, can have implications for things like, university admissions, or even identifying individuals who might need extra support in school.
Definitely. And I always found it curious that, males tend to have slightly higher average scores on those big college entrance exams like the SAT and ACT.
But then females often end up getting higher grades in college on average.
Right, which suggests that maybe these different measures are tapping into different aspects of intelligence or academic success,
Maybe those standardized tests are good at predicting who's going to do well on standardized tests.
but not necessarily who's going to thrive in a more complex real-world learning environment.
That's an interesting point. Okay, so we've talked about areas where males tend to have an advantage, on average.
But the review doesn't stop there, right?
No, it goes on to explore areas where females, on average, tend to excel.
And memory is a big one.
Yeah, they mentioned the study that looked at medical school applicants, and they found that women significantly outperformed men on memory tests.
And the difference wasn't just like a tiny blip.
No, it was a pretty substantial difference.
And one of the researchers actually suggested that the female advantage in memory might be even bigger than what we're capturing in research studies, because memory itself is such a multifaceted thing.
So it's not just one single type of memory.
Right. And that can make it tough to get really consistent results across different studies that are using different types of memory tasks.
I see. But despite that, a lot of studies do point to a female advantage in various aspects of memory, like visual memory, short-term memory, even working memory,
And these findings seem to hold up across different age groups,
and even in different cultures.
which makes it even more intriguing.
They also bring up that evolutionary hypothesis about women having better memory for spatial locations, potentially because of their roles in hunter-gatherer societies.
Oh, yeah, the idea that women were the ones who were primarily responsible for like gathering food and remembering where all the best berry patches and edible plants were located.
Exactly. And that kind of selective pressure over, millennia might have shaped their brains to be better at remembering those kinds of spatial details.
Fascinating. And it seems like it's not just about locations either.
No, the review also talks about females excelling in what's called associative memory.
Gotcha.
Basically remembering connections between things. So like remembering that this particular face goes with this particular name, or that this smell reminds you of this specific place.
Okay, so being good at making those kinds of links between different pieces of information.
Right. And when you look at those different types of memory, like episodic memory, which is for personal events and experiences, versus semantic memory, which is more for general knowledge and facts, research suggests that women might have an edge in episodic memory.
So they might be better at recalling details from like specific events in their lives.
Yeah, that's what the research suggests.
And it's not just memory. where we see this female advantage, it extends to language as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the review highlights female advantages in things like spelling, reading comprehension, and writing.
And those differences often start to show up really early in development.
Yeah, like girls as young as 1 to 5 years old often show greater proficiency in language skills.
There's even some evidence suggesting that girls might start talking a bit earlier than boys on average.
And they might tend to produce longer and more grammatically complex utterances.
And the research on vocabulary development in toddlers is really interesting. They found this significant word gap favoring girls, which actually seems to grow even bigger between the ages of 16 and 24 months.
Wow, that's a pretty critical period for language development.
Yeah, it is. And what's particularly intriguing is that this difference in vocabulary growth wasn't related to how much the mothers were talking to their sons versus their daughters.
So it wasn't just that the girls were getting more language input. It seemed like there might be some actual differences in their ability to, like, soak up and retain new words.
That's what the researchers concluded, that there might be these early capacity differences.
And the fact that females tend to have an advantage in writing, that's actually been taken into consideration in the design of those high-stakes tests, like the PSAT and the GRE.
Really?
Yeah, the inclusion of writing sections on those tests was partly motivated by a desire to make the tests more equitable for both sexes.
Makes sense if females, on average, tend to be stronger writers.
Right. And the review makes a good point that writing skills really align with a lot of our broader conceptions of what it means to be intelligent, even though they haven't always been like a central focus in traditional IQ tests.
That's a good point. Like being able to express your thoughts clearly and persuasively, that's definitely a valuable skill.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've seen this really complex picture emerge, right? It's clearly not about one sex being just plain smarter overall, but rather that there are these average differences in specific cognitive areas.
Right. Different strengths and weaknesses, so to speak.
Which, of course, makes us wonder, where do these differences come from? And the review really moves beyond that, simplistic nature versus nurture debate.
Right, because it's never that simple.
And they really emphasize this, what they call a psychobiosocial model.
Psychobiosocial, what does that mean?
Well, the basic idea is that a lot of the things that affect our cognitive abilities, they're both biological and social. It's not like we can neatly separate them into, like, this is nature and this is nurture.
So it's more of an interaction, a constant back and forth.
Exactly.
And learning itself is a great example of this, right?
Definitely. Like, the way our brains learn has a very real biological basis in, the structure and function of neurons and synapses.
But the things we learn and how well we learn them are massively influenced by our social environment and experiences.
Right. And what's really cool is that modern neuroscience is giving us this increasingly detailed view of how learning actually changes the physical structure of our brains.
So it's not just some abstract process, it's literally rewiring our brains.
Exactly. Like, with learning and experience, you can actually see changes in the size and complexity of neurons and the number of connections between them.
So that kind of blurs the line even further between nature and nurture.
Totally. And the review also gets into the role of hormones, specifically those gonadal hormones, like estrogen in women and testosterone in men.
Right, those hormones that are involved in like sexual development and reproduction.
Yeah. And while there are ethical limits on how much we can directly experiment with hormone levels in humans, research using animal models and looking at people who have, naturally occurring variations in hormone levels or medically induced changes, that research suggests that these hormones do seem to have significant effects on certain cognitive abilities.
Interesting. And it's not just about like those big obvious differences in hormone levels.
No, they point out that even normal fluctuations in hormone levels within, healthy adults, those can be correlated with performance on certain cognitive tasks.
So like a woman's menstrual cycle might have some subtle effects on her cognitive abilities at different points in the cycle.
Right. And one of the things that's getting a lot of attention these days is the role of estrogen in maintaining cognitive function as women age.
Especially with more and more women using estrogen replacement therapy, EART, after menopause.
Yeah, and the research is showing that EATR can actually have some really positive effects on cognitive abilities in older women.
Really? Like what kinds of effects?
Well, they've found improvements in things like short-term visual memory, visual perception, even spatial abilities.
Wow, that's significant.
And there's even research suggesting that EATR-D might play a role in protecting against Alzheimer's disease.
So not just maintaining cognitive function, but potentially even preventing decline.
Exactly. And they've even found some observable changes in the brains of animals that are given IRIT.
Like what?
Things like, increased growth of neurons and faster communication between neurons,
Wow, so actually changing the physical structure of the brain.
which again shows how intertwined biology and experience really are.
It's not just one or the other.
And the review reminds us that even though these hormone effects might seem purely biological, they're also influenced by environmental factors.
Like what?
Well, things like diet, for example, like eating foods that are high in plant estrogens, like soybeans.
So what we eat can actually affect our hormone levels, which can then affect our cognitive abilities.
It's all connected.
It really is.
And speaking of connections, the review also brings up this really important point about how our beliefs about group differences, those stereotypes we all carry around, can actually affect how we perform on cognitive tests.
Oh yeah, that stereotype threat stuff.
Exactly. Like, if you're aware of a negative stereotype about your group and you're taking a test that's supposed to measure that ability, it can actually make you perform worse, even if you don't consciously believe the stereotype.
Like you're so worried about confirming the stereotype that it messes with your thinking.
Yeah, it's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
And what's even more wild is that some research has shown that this stereotype activation can happen even without people being consciously aware of it.
So just subtle cues in the environment, or even just being asked to, like, indicate your gender on a form before the test, that can be enough to trigger this stereotype threat.
Wow, that's crazy. And what makes this whole thing even more complicated is that research has also shown that a lot of these stereotypes actually do reflect real statistical differences that exist in the population.
So it's this chicken and egg problem. Like, are the stereotypes causing the differences, or are they just reflecting the differences that are already there?
Right. It's really hard to disentangle.
And that's one of the reasons why this psychobiosocial model is so useful, because it allows for this complex interplay of multiple factors all happening at the same time.
Okay, so remind me again, what's the key takeaway from this psychobiosocial model?
Well, it's basically this idea that, our environment can actually change our biology, which then influences the choices we make. And those choices then further modify our biology. It's like this constant feedback loop.
So it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature via nurture.
Exactly. Like, they give the example of a child who shows some natural talent in, let's say, music.
Okay.
So they get encouraged and given opportunities to develop that talent.
Which then leads to them getting even better at music.
Right. And that success then fuels their motivation to practice even more.
And all that practice can actually lead to changes in their brain, strengthening the neural pathways involved in musical ability.
Exactly. It's this beautiful, dynamic interplay of biology, experience, and behavior.
Cool. Makes a lot of sense. And the review also touches on the role that schools play in all of this.
Yeah, they mentioned that report from the AAUW that expressed concern about how schools might be unintentionally shortchanging girls in some ways.
Oh, really? In what ways?
Like, in terms of how much attention teachers give them, how often they're called on to answer questions, how much time they're given to think before they have to respond, and the kind of encouragement they receive.
Interesting.
But the review also presents kind of a counter argument from another researcher who basically says, well, if girls are being shortchanged, how come they're getting higher grades in school on average and are less likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities?
Okay, so raising the question of, are boys the ones who are actually struggling more in the current school system?
Yeah, that's his point.
Yeah.
And he also points out that, boys, especially minority boys, tend to have much higher high school dropout rates.
Which is a huge problem.
Absolutely. And while the review acknowledges that there's definitely underrepresentation of females in certain STEM fields, this other perspective is basically saying, well, that's a problem, but it might be dwarfed by this larger problem of boys not even completing high school.
Wow, that puts things in perspective.
So bringing it all back to this question of the smarter sex, it's clear that the data don't support that idea at all when we look at overall measures of intelligence.
So no clear winner in the battle of the sexes when it comes to overall smarts.
Right, but we do see these average differences in certain specific cognitive areas. Like we talked about, females, on average, having advantages in verbal abilities and some aspects of memory.
And males, on average, tending to show advantages in certain visual, spatial, and mathematical tasks.
Exactly. But it's so crucial to remember that these are just averages across large groups.
They don't tell us anything definitive about any individual person.
Right. And it's also important to keep in mind that even reporting these differences can contribute to those self-fulfilling prophecies we talked about earlier.
Oh yeah, that's stereotype threat stuff.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
if people start to believe that, girls are just naturally bad at math or boys are just naturally bad at reading, then they might not even try to improve in those areas.
So it's almost like we're limiting ourselves by buying into these stereotypes.
And the other really important point is that these differences aren't, like, set in stone.
So they're not just like hardwired into our brains from birth and unchangeable.
Not at all. Our brains are incredibly plastic, which means they're capable of changing and adapting throughout our lives.
So these patterns of cognitive abilities, they can change over time in response to our experiences and the environments we're exposed to.
And that old nature versus nurture debate, it just doesn't capture this dynamic reality of how our brains work.
Right. It's not this either thing. It's a constant interaction.
And there's so much exciting research happening right now that's exploring ways to understand and potentially even enhance intelligence and cognitive longevity.
Like the research on EOT that we talked about.
Exactly. And all sorts of other interventions as well. So it's a really exciting time to be studying the brain and its amazing capabilities.
It really is.
And as we look to the future,